I never expected kindness from the enemy. Not in that house, not at that table, not in the middle of a war. My name is Klaus Richter. I was a soldier once, a German. Then I was captured, and everything I thought I knew about the world began to unravel. The first time I stepped into that farmhouse, I braced myself for hatred, for suspicion, for the cold stare that marks you as less than human. Instead, I smelled roasted chicken, fresh bread. I saw a woman's tired eyes, not filled with rage but with something softer, and a man, rough and weathered, whose patience unsettled me more than any guard's shout ever could. I told myself it was a trick, some kind of trap, but then the little girls peeked around the corner, curious, giggling, too innocent to play at deception. And for the first time, I wondered if I was the one who had been deceived all along. The affection between Martha and Thomas. It was a simple thing, really. A shared glance across the table, a hand resting briefly on a shoulder. But it struck me, like a blow, right to the gut. I'd seen so much ugliness, so much desperation, that such quiet tenderness felt like a foreign language. My own family, my own memories. They were so far away, shrouded in the smoke of burning cities. I sat there, stiff-backed, trying to make myself small. The wooden chair felt hard beneath me, the air thick with the smell of roasted chicken and something sweet, like apples. Not the stench of cordite, not the damp earth of a foxhole. This was different, dangerously different. My mind screamed at me, they are the enemy. But my eyes, they saw only a woman, tired but kind, serving food she'd clearly spent hours preparing. And a man, his face weathered, but his eyes, they weren't filled with hate, just a weary sort of patience. The first few days I barely spoke, just yes sir, no sir, when Thomas asked me to fetch a tool or help with a fence post. My English was clumsy, broken, learned from textbooks and shouted orders. I expected suspicion, curses, perhaps even a spit in my direction. Instead, there was this quiet, a silence that felt heavier than any shouting match. It made me nervous. What were they planning? This couldn't be real. We worked the fields, Thomas and I. The sun beat down, relentless, on the Kansas plains. I'd known hard labor in the army, digging trenches, hauling supplies, but this was different. This was about growth, about coaxing life from the soil, not tearing it apart. Thomas showed me how to plant corn, how to mend a broken plow. His hands, thick and strong, moved with a practiced grace. He didn't shout, didn't mock my mistakes. Just a nod, a quiet correction, sometimes a grunt. I kept waiting for the trap, for the moment he'd remind me I was a prisoner, an enemy soldier. It never came. One afternoon, the sun was a hammer on my head, my throat dry as dust. We'd been pulling stubborn weeds from a patch of tomatoes. Thomas straightened up, wiped his brow with the back of his hand. "Break time, Klaus," he said, his voice raspy. He walked over to a well, drew up a bucket, and offered me the dipper first. The water was icy, sweet. It slid down my throat like a blessing. I drank deep, watching him from under my hat. He didn't touch his own water until I had finished. A simple gesture, but it felt like something I hadn't felt in years. Then there were the girls, Sarah and Emily. Young, maybe 6 and 8, bright-eyed, full of endless questions. They'd watch me from the porch, sometimes peeking around the corner of the barn. At first they were shy, almost afraid. I was a German after all, the monster from the stories. I tried to keep my distance, to be invisible. But children, they have a way of seeing past the uniforms, past the labels. One evening, after dinner, Martha was clearing the table. Emily, the younger one, dropped a spoon. It clattered loudly on the wooden floor. I instinctively flinched. My body still remembered the sudden, sharp sounds of war. Emily looked at me, her eyes wide, a flicker of fear, and then, a moment later, a giggle. She picked up the spoon, held it out to me, a small, mischievous smile on her face. "You jump," she said, her voice clear as a bell. Martha just smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. It wasn't ridicule, it was understanding. That little girl, she saw something in me, something beyond the uniform I no longer wore. And for a split second, I didn't feel like a prisoner. I felt like a man who'd just jumped at a spoon. A bit foolish, perhaps. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. This hospitality, this normalcy. It felt like a thin veneer, ready to crack. Any moment I expected the mask to drop, the true face of the enemy to emerge. They were Americans. Their brothers, their sons, were fighting my brothers, my sons in Europe. How could they simply feed me, work alongside me, treat me with a dignity I hadn't expected to find even among my own people anymore? My mind raced, trying to find the angle, the hidden motive. Was this some new form of psychological torture? To lull me into a false sense of security, then? What? The propaganda back home had painted them as ruthless, bloodthirsty. But these people, the Jensens, they were just farmers. Thomas, he'd talk sometimes while we hitched the horses or sharpened the scythes. Not about the war, never about the war. He'd talk about the weather, about the price of wheat, about the strange summer that year. He'd tell me about his father who'd built this farm from nothing, stories of the land, of struggle and harvest. And I just listened. My hands moved, doing the work, but my ears, they were open. And slowly, imperceptibly, something inside me, something hard and cold, began to shift. A tiny, almost imperceptible crack in the armor I'd worn for so long. It was terrifying, because if they weren't the monsters I'd been told, then what did that make me? And what did it make of everything I'd believed? That question, it gnawed at me. Every morning, when the sun climbed over the Kansas fields, painting them in gold and amber, I'd wake up with it twisting in my gut. If they weren't the monsters, then what was I? What was all of it? The parades, the speeches, the fierce belief in our cause, it all started to feel like a flimsy paper screen, and the Jensens, they were just quietly, patiently poking holes in it. Martha, she was a quiet woman. Her hands were always busy, kneading dough, mending clothes, tending a small garden behind the house. She didn't talk much, but her eyes, they missed nothing. I'd catch her looking at me sometimes, not with judgment, but with a kind of weary understanding. One evening, I remember it clearly, a late summer storm had rolled in. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the windows. We were all inside, the girls huddled close to Martha, reading a story by the dim light of a kerosene lamp. The electricity was out, of course. Martha brought me a cup of hot tea, steaming in a chipped mug. "For the chill," she said, her voice soft, almost lost in the storm's roar. It was just tea, but it was a warmth I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Not just in my hands, but deep inside, melting something I didn't even know was frozen. I just nodded, couldn't find the words. My throat felt thick. The girls, Sarah and Emily, they started to get bolder. They'd follow me around the barn, asking questions about Germany. "Is it always cold there?" Emily once asked, her nose wrinkling. "Do you have cows this big?" Sarah chimed in. I tried to answer, stumbling over my English. I probably sounded like an idiot. I remembered the stern warnings from my superiors. Do not fraternize with the enemy. Do not reveal information. But these were just children. What harm could their questions do? One afternoon, Emily, the little one, she brought me a drawing, a crayon drawing of a stick figure, with a big lopsided smile, standing next to a cow. She pointed at the stick figure. "That's you, Klaus," she declared proudly. My stomach did a strange flip. Me, drawn by an American child. It was absurd, almost funny, in a way. I mean, my uniform, my rifle, the fear I'd inspired, and now I was a smiling stick figure next to a cow. Thomas, he was different. More reserved. We spent our days under the vast Kansas sky, the sun baking the earth. We worked in silence mostly, the rhythmic creak of the plow, the rustle of the corn, the buzz of insects. But sometimes he'd tell me stories about the land, how his grandfather had broken the prairie, how the Dust Bowl almost took everything. He spoke of the land with a reverence I understood. It wasn't about conquest, about taking. It was about tending, about living with. One day we were fixing a fence. The old barbed wire rusted and broken. My hand slipped and a barb tore a deep gash in my palm. It stung like hell. I cursed under my breath, a German word. Thomas didn't flinch. He just looked at my hand, then pulled out a handkerchief, surprisingly clean, from his pocket. He wrapped it around my hand tightly. "Careful, son," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "This land, she can bite. Son." He called me son. It wasn't a term of endearment, not really. More like a general address, a farmer to a younger man. But it landed like a punch. A soft, unexpected punch. I tried to keep my guard up truly. Every morning I'd tell myself, "Remember who you are. Remember what you've seen. This is a trick. But then I'd sit at their table, eating Martha's warm bread, hearing the girls chatter, and it all felt so real, so undeniably human. I remembered the faces of the people back home, the ones I was fighting for, but they were becoming blurry, distant, like old photographs. And the faces in front of me, the Jensens, they were sharp, vivid, alive. It was a betrayal. I knew it. A betrayal of my country, of my comrades, of everything I'd been taught. But I couldn't stop it. The warmth, the quiet dignity. It was seeping into my bones, replacing the cold, hard fear. There was one evening, I remember it with a clarity that still chills me. I was outside, sitting on the porch swing, watching the stars blaze across the impossibly wide sky. Back home, the sky was often obscured by smoke, by the relentless drone of bombers. Here, it was endless. Thomas came out, sat beside me. We sat in silence for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. My brother, he's in Europe, fighting. He didn't say anything more. He didn't have to. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken grief, with the shared weight of a war that separated us, yet somehow, paradoxically, brought us together under this vast, indifferent sky. He was talking about my war, the one I'd left, the one I'd been a part of, and for a moment, the world tilted. His brother, my enemy, and yet here we were, two men, sharing a porch swing, sharing the quiet agony of the same distant conflict. What did that make us? What did that make of the lines drawn on maps, the uniforms we wore, the flags we saluted? The thought, it was a dangerous one, a terrifying one. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into an abyss of doubt. That night, after Thomas spoke those words, my brother, he's in Europe, fighting, I couldn't sleep. The silence of the Kansas night was deafening. No distant artillery, no screams, just the chirping of crickets and the gentle creak of the old farmhouse. His brother, my enemy. But Thomas, he wasn't an enemy. He was just Thomas, a man who shared his water, who taught me about corn, who sat next to me on a porch swing. The labels, the propaganda, they felt like dust in the wind, blowing away with every quiet gesture, every shared silence. It was like a dam breaking inside me, a slow, terrifying flood of doubt. Everything I had believed, everything I had fought for, it felt hollow. The next morning, I was still wrestling with it. The sun rose, indifferent to my turmoil, painting the fields in hues of gold. I went to the barn, my movements stiff. Sarah and Emily were already there, chasing chickens. Emily, the smaller one, stumbled and scraped her knee. She started to cry, a small, piteous sound. My first instinct was to keep my distance. I was a prisoner, a German. What right did I have to comfort an American child? But Martha wasn't around. Thomas was already in the fields. I hesitated, then knelt down. It's all right, I mumbled, my English still awkward. I took out my handkerchief, the one Thomas had used on my hand, and gently dabbed at her knee. She looked at me, her eyes wet, but not with fear, just pain. And then, a small, trusting hand reached out and gripped my finger. A tiny, warm hand. It was a jolt. A strange, almost unbearable tenderness. I remembered my own little sister, so far away, her face a fading image. Later that day, Thomas and I were mending a fence line that stretched for what seemed like miles. The sun was relentless, baking the earth. We worked in a comfortable rhythm now, a rhythm born of shared labor. He pointed to a distant cluster of trees. There, he said, that's where the old man Richter used to live. No relation, I suppose. He chuckled, a dry, dusty sound. Richter, my name. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, Klaus Richter, a German soldier, fixing a fence on a farm in Kansas, and Thomas Jensen was talking about another Richter, long gone. It was a moment of strange, almost surreal humor. The world was so much smaller and stranger than I had ever imagined. I managed a small, tight smile. No, I said, no relation. But in that moment, it felt like we were all somehow related, bound by the land, by the simple act of living. Martha, she had a way of noticing things. One afternoon, I was struggling with a stubborn bolt on a piece of machinery. My hands were sore, my temper fraying. I muttered a string of German curses under my breath. Martha, who was passing by with a basket of laundry, paused. She didn't say anything, just watched me for a moment. Then she walked into the house and came back with a small jar of salve. "For your hands," she said, her voice soft. "They look raw." She didn't ask what I was muttering. She didn't judge. Just a simple act of kindness, recognizing the weariness in my hands. It was a gesture that spoke volumes, a silent acknowledgement of my humanity, not my uniform or my nationality. It disarmed me completely. How do you fight an enemy who offers you salve for your wounds? The days blurred into weeks. The seasons began to turn. The oppressive heat of summer slowly gave way to the crisp air of autumn. The corn, which I had helped plant, grew tall and golden, ready for harvest. I had never seen anything like it. The sheer scale of it. Thomas, he taught me how to drive the tractor, a rumbling ancient machine that smelled of oil and earth. It was a strange sensation, sitting on that metal seat, feeling the vibrations through my body, guiding the machine across the vast fields. Me, a German infantryman, driving a tractor in Kansas. It felt like a dream, a completely different life. Sometimes I'd catch myself smiling, a genuine smile, as I watched the dust plume behind the tractor, the rows of corn falling neatly into the machine's maw. Then a sudden jolt. A radio broadcast from the house, faint but clear, talking about the war, about the battles, about us. And the smile would vanish, replaced by that familiar knot in my stomach. The war was still out there. My war. I remember one evening, the sky was a bruised purple, and a storm was brewing on the horizon. The wind picked up, rustling through the drying corn. Thomas and I were rushing to get the last of the hay bales into the barn. It was heavy, back-breaking work. Sweat stung my eyes. As I lifted a particularly awkward bale, my foot slipped on a patch of mud, and I went down hard, the bale landing half on top of me. I let out a grunt of pain. Thomas was there in an instant, pulling the bale off me, his face etched with concern. He didn't laugh, didn't scold, just helped me up, brushing the hay from my clothes. "You all right, Klaus?" he asked, his hand firm on my shoulder. That was a close one. It wasn't a question of whether I was a German or an American. It was a question of whether I was hurt. A man helping another man. It was a simple moment, an everyday mishap on a farm, but it resonated deeply. It stripped away all the layers of ideology, all the years of indoctrination, leaving only the raw, undeniable fact of shared vulnerability. The girls, Sarah and Emily, they started to teach me English words, not from books, but from life. "Butterfly," Emily would say, pointing to a monarch fluttering past. "Barn owl," Sarah would whisper, her eyes wide, as a silent shadow swept across the twilight sky. They didn't know they were dismantling my world, one simple word at a time. They just saw a man who needed to learn, a man who listened patiently to their endless chatter. I found myself telling them about the forests in Germany, about the snow, about the animals. Stories I hadn't thought about in years. Stories that felt innocent, far removed from the horror I had witnessed. It felt liberating, like exhaling a breath I didn't know I was holding. But then, the guilt would creep in. Was I forgetting? Was I betraying my past, my comrades, my country? This place, this farm, this family. It was a beautiful, dangerous trap. It was making me question everything. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. Not the barbed wire, not the guards, not even the idea of being so far from home. It was the slow, insidious way this place, these people, were dismantling me, piece by piece, taking apart the soldier I was, the German I was told to be. It felt like treason. Every laugh from Emily, every quiet nod from Thomas, every warm meal from Martha. It was a hammer blow to the walls I'd built around myself. I still remembered my uniform, the weight of the rifle. Here, I wore patched overalls, smelling of hay and dust. My hands, once trained to kill, now knew the feel of rich soil, the rough bark of an oak. Which life was truer? One morning, old Bessie, a cow, was having trouble calving. Thomas was worried. We worked for hours, her low moans filling the barn. I'd heard similar cries from wounded men. This was about bringing life. Finally, a small, wet calf slipped out. Thomas, covered in muck, gently stroked its head. "Welcome to Kansas, little one," he murmured. I had seen so much death. To be part of this fragile beginning, it was overwhelming. I thought about the orders, the enemy. And here I was, helping deliver a calf with the enemy. It seemed absurd. My superiors would have had me shot. It almost made me laugh, a bitter, hollow sound. The girls, they named the calf Lucky. They'd bring it wildflowers. They didn't see me as a German infantryman, POW. They saw me as the man who helped with Lucky. Their world was so simple, unburdened by hate. It reflected back a version of myself I hadn't seen in years. Martha, she noticed everything. One afternoon, I was whittling a small bird for Emily. My hands remembered the skill. Martha sat beside me, watching. "You have good hands, Klaus," she said, soft. "Hands for making things." It felt like absolution, like she saw beyond the soldier. I just nodded, my eyes stinging. What could I say? My hands have also taken lives, Martha. Many lives. The guilt was a heavy stone. Was I forgetting? Betraying the men I had fought alongside? At night, I'd see their faces, hear their screams. Then I'd hear Thomas snoring, the rustle of wind, and the two worlds would collide violently in my head. It was a torment. Thomas, he never spoke directly about the war, but sometimes a look would pass between us when we heard a distant train whistle or saw newspaper headlines about battles far away. A shared glance, a heavy silence. It was a recognition. We were both caught in its shadow. He, worried for his brother. Me, a ghost of the conflict itself. I learned to tell a good ear of corn from a bad one. Klaus Richter, master of corn selection. My mother would have laughed. She always said I was useless with anything that grew. The things you learn when you're a prisoner. Autumn came, painting the fields in hues of rust and gold. The air grew crisp. It was beautiful. Too beautiful sometimes. It made me ache for a home that no longer existed, for a past that was slipping away. I hadn't expected to belong. One day, Thomas came back from town, his face grim. He didn't say much. Later, I heard them talking. "Casualties," Martha whispered. "From the Ardennes." My blood ran cold. I had fought there. My comrades, were still fighting. And Thomas's brother, was he there too? The war, it wasn't just a distant rumble here. It was a knife, twisting in their hearts, just as it had twisted in mine. That night, I felt the familiar cold dread creep back. The walls I had tried to dismantle, they tried to rebuild. The enemy, the war, the lines were drawn in blood. But then I looked at Martha's face, etched with worry, and Thomas's silent grief, and I couldn't see the enemy anymore. I just saw people, hurting, just like the people back home, just like me. It was a terrible realization, a dangerous one. If they were just people, then what was I? What had I done? What had we done? The comfortable certainty of us versus them was crumbling, leaving me exposed, raw, terrified of the truth that was slowly, inexorably revealing itself here, in the heart of the enemy's land. That feeling, that raw exposure, it lingered. It was like I was walking around without skin. Every breeze, every touch, a shock. My own thoughts, once so clear, so defined by the party line, now felt like a tangled mess. I tried to push it away, tried to remember the faces of my comrades, the roar of the crowds, the words of the Führer, but they were whispers now, distant echoes against the solid, undeniable presence of Martha, Thomas, Sarah, and Emily. I remember one particular evening. The air was turning cold, a real Kansas chill. Martha had made a stew, thick with vegetables from their garden. The girls were laughing, telling some silly story about a rabbit. Thomas, he just watched them, a soft smile on his face. And I was just there, at the table, eating. Not a prisoner, not an enemy, just a man sharing a meal. It felt so normal, so dangerously normal. My hands, they still remembered the cold steel of a rifle, but now they held a spoon, bringing warm food to my mouth. It was a strange kind of peace, a peace I hadn't earned, a peace that felt like a betrayal. I'd catch myself looking at Thomas, really looking. His calloused hands, the lines around his eyes from years of squinting at the sun. He wasn't a monster. He was just a farmer, a man who loved his family, worked his land, worried about the rain. And his brother, somewhere out there, fighting against my people. The thought was a constant, dull ache. How could I reconcile these two truths? The man across the table, kind and weary, and the abstract enemy I was supposed to hate. The gap between them felt like an ocean. Sometimes I'd go out to the barn late at night, just to be alone. The scent of hay, the quiet breathing of the animals. It was a different kind of silence than the one in the trenches. Here, it felt like possibility. There, it was only the quiet before the storm, the held breath before the next explosion. I'd sit on a bale, watching the moonlight stream through the cracks in the old wood, and I'd try to remember the hate, try to remember the anger that had fueled me for so long, but it was fading, like a photograph left too long in the sun. The girls, they were relentless in their innocence. Emily, the little one, she'd often bring me wildflowers she'd picked from the fields, dandelions mostly. "For you, Klaus," she'd say, holding them out with a sticky hand. I'd take them, these absurd yellow weeds, and try to find a place for them, maybe in a chipped mug on the workbench. It was such a small thing, a child's offering, but it felt like a weight, a heavy, beautiful weight, pressing down on my chest. How could I be the monster they talked about in the papers when this little girl saw me as someone worthy of a dandelion? Thomas, he had a subtle way of teaching, not just about farming, about life. One afternoon, we were mending a section of fence that had been battered by a recent windstorm. The posts were rotted, the wire tangled. It was frustrating work. I swore in German, a habit I couldn't seem to break. Thomas just paused, leaned on his hammer. "Sometimes, Klaus," he said, his voice quiet, "you just gotta start over. Can't fix what's broken beyond repair. Best to just clear it out, put in something new." He wasn't talking about the fence, not really, and I knew it. He was talking about me, about the broken pieces inside me. I remember the first time I truly laughed, a real, full belly laugh since I'd been captured. It was during harvest. The old tractor, Bessie, she was a cantankerous beast. I was trying to start her, pulling the crank, grunting and sweating. She just sputtered and died, over and over. Thomas was watching, leaning against the barn door, a wry smile on his face. Finally, with a particularly pathetic cough, she refused to start again. I threw my hands up in exasperation, a comical gesture. And Thomas, he just let out this big, booming laugh, a sound I hadn't heard from him before. And then, without thinking, I laughed too. A genuine, unforced laugh. It felt strange, foreign, but also liberating. For a moment, I wasn't a German POW. He wasn't an American farmer. We were just two men, defeated by a stubborn machine. It was a fleeting moment, but it lodged itself deep inside me. The cold dread still returned, of course, especially at night. The war was still raging. My comrades were dying, and I was here, laughing at a tractor, accepting dandelions, eating stew with the enemy. The guilt was a constant companion, a shadow that stretched long in the Kansas twilight. Was this what they wanted? To break my spirit? To make me forget? Or was it something else entirely? A different kind of weapon, perhaps. One that targeted the soul, not the body. It was far more effective. Martha, she sometimes hummed while she worked. Old folk songs, simple tunes. They were unfamiliar to me, but they had a soothing quality. One afternoon, she was baking bread, the smell filling the house with a warmth that was almost unbearable. I was sitting at the kitchen table, peeling potatoes. She started humming, a particularly poignant melody. I found myself listening, really listening, and then she looked up, caught my eye. "You know, Klaus," she said, her voice soft. "My grandmother, she used to sing this when she was sad. Said it helped her remember the good times." She didn't press. She didn't ask if I was sad. She just offered a shared piece of humanity, a quiet acknowledgement of sorrow. It was a moment of such profound, unexpected intimacy, and it made me wonder, for the first time, about her sorrows, her losses. The war wasn't just mine. It was theirs too. The world outside the farm, it felt increasingly distant. The newspaper headlines, when they arrived, felt like dispatches from another planet. The names of towns, the casualty figures, they were just numbers now. Here, life was tangible. The feel of the earth, the taste of fresh milk, the sound of the wind. This quiet, unassuming farm, it was slowly becoming my world. And the old world, the one of steel and fire, it was receding, like a nightmare upon waking. But the nightmare wasn't entirely gone. It was just waiting, lurking at the edges of my new reality. The thought of going back, of rejoining that world, felt like a return to a prison I had somehow miraculously escaped. But this freedom, this strange, unasked-for kindness, it came with its own heavy price, the price of questioning everything. That price, it was gnawing at me. Every night, the same images, the faces of my comrades frozen in the snow, the sound of distant shelling, a lullaby of death, and then, the morning, the smell of Martha's coffee, the sound of Emily's laughter. The contrast was a physical ache. It felt like I was living two lives, and one was slowly, brutally, killing the other. My old self, the soldier, was fighting a losing battle against the simple, overwhelming force of decency. I remember Thomas, one crisp autumn morning. We were out in the fields, clearing the last of the corn stalks. The air was sharp, biting. He paused, looking out over the vast expanse of their land. "You know, Klaus," he said, his breath pluming in the cold, "this land, she gives back what you put into her, good or bad." He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. I felt the weight of his words. The land, it was a mirror. What had I put into my own life? What had my country put into the world? The answers felt like shards of glass in my gut. The girls, they were my most potent, most innocent tormentors. Sarah, the older one, she'd sometimes ask me about my home. "Do you have big rivers in Germany, Klaus? Like the Missouri?" I'd try to describe the Rhine, the old castles, the forests. And as I spoke, I'd see it through their eyes, a place of fairy tales, not of war. It was a strange kind of cleansing, remembering beauty when all I associated with home was destruction. But then, the guilt. Was I painting a false picture? Was I forgetting the truth of what we had become? Martha, she sometimes left a slice of pie on the workbench for me after I'd finished my chores. Apple pie, warm, with a flaky crust. A simple gesture, but it tasted of home, of a childhood I'd lost. I'd eat it slowly, savoring each bite, feeling the warmth spread through me. And then I'd think of the rations, the hunger, the desperation. This pie, it was more than food. It was a challenge. A quiet, insistent question about mercy, about grace, in a world I thought had none left. The first winter storm arrived with a vengeance. Snow fell thick and fast, blanketing the fields in white. The world outside the farmhouse became hushed, isolated. We were trapped inside, a small island against the storm. Thomas taught me to play checkers by the fire. He was surprisingly good. I, a German infantryman, strategist of battlefields, was consistently beaten by a Kansas farmer at a board game. It was a small, almost ridiculous defeat, but it made me smile. A genuine smile, no bitterness. And for a moment, the war, the labels, they were just outside, lost in the swirling snow, but the storm couldn't keep everything at bay. The radio, when it crackled to life, brought news of the Ardennes, of fierce fighting, of losses on both sides. Thomas would listen, his face drawn, his eyes distant. I'd sit there, peeling potatoes, my hands moving mechanically, but my mind was back in the forests, the snow, the screams, his brother, my comrades. The war was a monster, devouring us all, no matter which side we were on. And here, in this warm kitchen, peeling potatoes, the sheer absurdity of it all struck me like a physical blow. That blow, it wasn't just physical, it was to my very core. How could I reconcile the monster I was told to hate with the man who taught me checkers, who worried about his cow, whose hands were just as calloused as mine? The world had flipped upside down. My loyalties, my understanding, everything was in flux. I felt like a traitor to my country, to my uniform, to the men I'd left behind. But then, when Martha would pass me a warm plate, or Emily would show me a drawing, that guilt would twist into something else entirely. A profound, aching confusion. One evening, Thomas found me in the barn just staring out into the snow. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just sat beside me, offered me a cigarette. American, of course. And we smoked in silence. The smell of the tobacco, it was different. Not like home, but the shared quiet, the understanding that passed between us without words. It was universal. He knew. He knew the weight of the war, even if our sides were different. He knew loss. I thought about my father, a stern man, a soldier himself. What would he say if he saw me now? A prisoner, smoking with the enemy, finding a strange comfort in their presence. He would be disgusted. And yet, this quiet farmer, he offered more humanity than I'd found in years of fighting. It was a truth I couldn't deny, a truth that burned. He would be disgusted. And yet, this quiet farmer, he offered more humanity than I'd found in years of fighting. It was a truth I couldn't deny, a truth that burned, That burning truth. It stripped away everything. The uniforms, the slogans, the carefully constructed walls of ideology. All of it fell away, leaving me exposed, raw. I started to see the world not as two opposing forces, but as countless individual lives, each with their own fears, their own loves, their own quiet battles. The enemy, I realized, wasn't a nation or a uniform. It was the hatred itself, the one they had fed us, the one I had carried. And here, in this small Kansas farmhouse, it was starving. The war ended, not with a bang, but with a crackle on the radio, a strained voice announcing surrender. Thomas and Martha listened, their faces a mixture of relief and weariness. I sat there, a German soldier in their kitchen, a strange silence filling the space. There was no jubilation from them, no triumphant shouts, just a deep collective sigh. For me, it was a different kind of shock. The world I had known, the one that had defined my purpose, it was simply gone, vanished. What was left? Just me and the echo of a war that had stolen my youth, but given me something far more precious in return. My time on the farm, it came to an end soon after. The day I left, it was a crisp morning, much like the one when I arrived. Martha had packed me a lunch, a small loaf of bread, some cheese. Thomas shook my hand, his grip firm, his eyes holding a depth of understanding that needed no words. The girls, Sarah and Emily, they clung to my legs. Emily, she pressed a crumpled drawing into my hand, a stick figure with yellow hair standing beside a much taller stick figure holding a dandelion. "Don't forget us, Klaus," Sarah whispered, and I knew I never would. The lump in my throat was real, physical. I was leaving a prison, yes, but I was also leaving a home I never expected to find. I returned to Germany, to a land scarred and broken, a place I barely recognized. The propaganda, the hate, it had all crumbled to dust. But the memory of that Kansas farm, it remained. It was a beacon, a quiet testament to a different way of being. I rebuilt my life, slowly, carefully. I never forgot the Jensens, their kindness, their simple humanity. It became the foundation of everything I believed in. It taught me that even in the darkest of times, light can be found in the most unexpected places, in the hearts of those you are told to hate. It taught me that common decency, a shared meal, a quiet laugh over a stubborn tractor, these are the true weapons against animosity. And so, here I am, an old man remembering the taste of Martha's pie, the weight of Emily's dandelions, the quiet wisdom of Thomas. They didn't just feed a prisoner, they fed a soul. They didn't just offer shelter, they offered a glimpse of a world where empathy could bridge even the deepest divides. The war tried to make me a monster, but the Jensens, they reminded me what it meant to be human. Therefore, I ask you, as you listen to my story, to look beyond the labels, beyond the rhetoric, beyond the easy narratives of good and evil. Look for the humanity in unexpected places. Seek out the quiet acts of kindness that defy the chaos. Because sometimes the most profound truths are found not on the battlefield, but in a simple farmhouse, on a quiet prairie, where an enemy became family. If this story touched you, if it made you think, please consider sharing it, and leave a comment below with your own thoughts on kindness in unexpected places.